The university town of Oxford. Many of New Zealand's earliest European immigrants were educated here before they ventured out into their new world. In fact, Christchurch was named after Christchurch College, not all that far from where I am now. But within 2 generations, the traffic was reversed. Young New Zealand scholars began coming back to Oxford here once they'd outrun the educational resources at home. And since early this century, Rhodes scholarships creamed off many of the brightest and best young New Zealanders, brought them here and tended to overqualify them or perhaps over-specialise them for a career back home. Now in 1936, one such Rhodes scholar came here, got himself a first-rate degree, fought his war with the New Zealand division, in fact wrote the official war history of the Battle of Crete. He became an emeritus fellow of Balliol College, and when he retired just a few years ago, he was Deputy Chief Executive of Oxford University Press, one of the world's biggest book publishing houses. Now I'm here in Oxford to talk to that Rhodes scholar, Davin, because although he's lived here for nearly 50 years now, he's established himself as a major writer of New Zealand fiction.
I can remember noticing the cemetery outside the railway station as we approached the city of Gleaming Spires and inferring a certain lesson from that. Actually arriving in the college, yes, curious feeling that one was starting school all over again or starting from scratch, and the sudden realization that from being cock of one's own dunghill in Otago, one was down at scratching around at the bottom and had a long way to climb to the top of a much larger dunghill. It was recognisably what it still is, but more beautiful and less terribly overcrowded than it is now. The corn market was a street you could walk up and down without jostling into people. There was a fine old pub called the Clarendon Arms, and in general it was simpler than it is now, but in many ways less free.
This is the country of Davin's childhood, Southland, a green landscape with its cool, damp climate. Enough like the old country to attract migrants like Davin's father away from the poverty and landlordism without making them feel too alien. The only alternative to farming where they came from was the cramped industrial city. The father had left school in Galway at the age of 13, in a hurry. He went to help an older brother who had attacked their teacher, and then they fled the school, never to return.
He had emigrated to escape from the miserable, poor farms of Galway, and what he wanted was a job in the government. And what better job in the government could be than in the government railways? But then he discovered that he had to have a minimum educational qualification. By this time he was aged about 22 or 3, I suppose, and he went to the old Clyde Street Merris Brothers School, and he went back with the kids and got through to standard 3 or 4 or whatever was necessary, and that enabled him to join the railway, where he stayed for the rest of his working life.
You wrote once that you came from a family of mimics and raconteurs. What sort of stories did you tell in the home?
Well, it rather depended. After Mass on a Sunday, my mother, poor wretch, had to reckon with an untold number of Irishmen who might descend, whom my father would have met after 11 o'clock Mass and invited home for lunch. So the joint had to be of sort of incalculable infinite dimensions. And if that happened, then they would all go up into the front room, which wasn't otherwise used because the sun might stain the carpenter. And they would there sit all the afternoon laughing and rollicking away, but they would be talking in Irish, so one wouldn't know what the hell they were talking about, except it was usually about fights that had taken place after the Galway races or something, 10 or 20 years back. But in our domestic life, which was mainly led in the kitchen, the talk would be of anecdotes made out of virtually nothing, of how you saw Piggy Walsh dragging a suitcase along Venus Street one afternoon. Now I wonder what he had in that. I wonder what he had in that suitcase, that Gadsden bag, or whatever it was. And from then they would spin out all kinds of fantasies. And of course, visitors never dared to go away because they knew that as soon as they did, they would be very closely mimicked. Because both my father and my mother were very, very accurate mimics, as illiterate but intelligent people very often are.
There was no educational tradition in the family. There were very few books and none of them fiction. What were the influences that made you start reading?
The absence of books in the household was due, I think, largely to the fact that they belonged to an oral tradition and they got their amusement, as today's generation gets it, out of looking at television. They got theirs out of telling stories to one another and singing songs. There was an awful lot of singing went on in both Gaelic and Irish, because Gaelic was my father's first language and my mother's first language, and so they had an awful lot of Irish in common. And then there were all the sort of boring ballads about she's far from the land and endless melancholy exile songs. So there wasn't much need for books, really. I taught myself to read without disclosing to my parents that I could read, and it wasn't until they caught me reading either Riders of the Purple Sage or another one of which I've now forgotten the name, that they discovered I could read. So I was then sent off to the nuns' kindergarten, Sisters of Mercy in Gore, where I rapidly became sort of champion reader alongside a girl called Tui Waring, whose father managed the local Fleming's fowl mill, I think it was. And Tui was a beautiful blonde, and I think she must have been the first girl I was in love with. At any rate, she's the first one I can remember being in love with. And I can remember we used to walk through the buttercups, which in those days grew along the main street of Gore. And I can remember the yellow dancing on our bare legs as we walked, and the yellow in our hair, and seeing how the yellows matched, and taking great pleasure from this.
The Davins were townies, but early this century the country lapped right into the suburbs of provincial New Zealand boroughs like Invercargill. Dan's boyhood was lived in lots of space and without time stress, ideal for acting out adventure fantasies. The stories about young Mick Connolly have been described as almost an historical and social documentary of Southland at that time. How much of the real Mick Connolly was you, the romantic child?
Well, not really, I would have thought, but you've got to have a starting point. When I was writing a lot of those stories, I was making practice strokes towards writing a novel, and I was trying out my hand in various directions.
Goosey's Roman army was getting a bit beyond a joke. My father's cows would be feeding, their heads down and all facing in the same direction towards the wind. Goosey's army would march towards him in artillery formation, with a few light-armed troops skirmishing on each flank with Shanghais. When they got within about 30 yards of the cows, Goosey would give the word of command and the two files of infantry would peel off into the line of battle. Then another word of command and the slingers would let fly over the heads of the infantry with stones from their shangais. At the same time, the infantry would hurl their manuka javelins and then charge, swords drawn. Goosey would be a few yards in front, waving his bayonet and shouting. So, we had a council of war with our two younger brothers. Tom, that's my older brother, said envoys would have to be sent to Goosey to protest against the attack on our cows and discuss whether it was to be peace or war. So it was decided that Tom and I would go after tea.
Where do you think you're going?
Where's Goosey?
What do you want to know for? What do you want?
You were chasing our cows this afternoon.
We were conducting a punitive expedition.
Call it what you like, but as far as I'm concerned, it was chasing our cows. And I'm not going to have a pack of bloody kids chasing our cows when one of them's in calf and the rest are in milk, or any other time for that matter.
You aren't you? We'll have to see about that. Are you prepared to give hostages or guarantees for their conduct in future? If so, I'm prepared to grant them an amnesty.
Even if we wanted your silly amnesty, it wouldn't be much use when you start leaving our gates open so our cows can get out and get into trouble on the roads, frightening the wits out of drunks who don't know a pair of cow's horns from the devil's. So you know what you can do with your amnesty. You leave our cows and fences alone.
Or else what?
It boils down to this. Either you promise to leave our cows alone, or your army of kids is going to take a thrashing. I give you fair warning.
Then it's war.
Call it what you like, but you aren't going to like it when it comes.
I give you safe conduct back to the frontier. After that, watch out, that's all.
To hell with you and your safe conduct.
I've given you my word and you won't provoke me to break it. You have been warned.
Every novelist has got to work from experience, and your experience is like a set of jigsaw pieces or whatever the hell you use when you're playing Scrabble, and each of them is genuine and belongs to you. But when you put them together, you've got an infinite series of possibilities of what might emerge at the top. So the ultimate pattern need not necessarily correspond to experience at all. To your actual biography at all. And this is a point which is very difficult to enunciate, but which most people don't seem to be able to grasp. And the more real and true to their own experience something that you relate is, the more they are convinced that it must have happened to you, but it needn't necessarily have happened to you. I mean, I've borrowed episodes from my cousins and all manner of people, not to speak of making up quite a few for myself, in order to make my pattern correct. But I wouldn't deny for a moment or feel it necessary to use a word so pejorative as denial, that many of the ingredients, of course, belong to the life that I knew. How else could I have written them?
When did you first decide that you wanted to be a writer?
I have a feeling it was somewhere about, I think I mentioned a while ago that as round about the age of puberty, numbers got smaller, not of course round numbers, and words got larger. And I found that I was so consistently doing better in writing essays and whatnot than I had been, than I now was in algebra and what have you. I had been quite good until I encountered the problems of algebra and theorems and geometry and whatnot, where whatever creative part of my mind existed didn't seem to operate. Whereas in literature, for some reason or other, one seemed to be able to get through to one's teachers. And then I found myself, when we took on Latin and French and whatnot, taking them to like a duck to water. And I began to feel that language really was my medium. And I began to resolve that I would get out and become a writer.
Davin was a star pupil at Marist Brothers School in Invercargill. His matriculation results in 1929 were so good, his headmaster recommended him for a scholarship to Sacred Heart College in Auckland. For a free-ranging Southland boy, the new discipline and the confinement of a boarding school called for a lot of personal adjustment.
I didn't want to go, but I made it a condition of my mother, of my acceptance, that she should never reproach me with whatever my education cost. And of course it began to cost money straight away, because first of all I had to go to the Catholic dentist, who was the worst dentist in town, who promptly removed my 4 front teeth on the New Zealand principle that you're better off without them. And I had to buy 2 shirts, which I'd never had before in my life, and 2 suits, which was unspeakably extravagant. But nonetheless, with all this equipment, my mother must have drawn on her secret trustees' bank savings, because my mother had to lead a very careful life owing to the fact that most of her relations were either drunk or unemployed or both, and she had to feed them and supply them surreptitiously with money. And so away I went to Auckland, and after being in captivity for about a month, I thought, by God, I'll never survive this for 2 years. And the system was that in your first year, in the 6th form, you were taken for trial trips over Beaches Brook and so forth, so that in the 2nd year you would have been over the course. And I made up my mind that I was going to do it the first time and not the second. So I did that, and so I got a scholarship at the end of 1930 to Otago, and the scholarship was, I've forgotten what, but it was about £100 a year or £50 a year or something like that. And my mother added £1 a week to that, with God knows what exactions and difficulties and privations of her own. And since board was only 22 and 6 a week, provided you didn't have a fire and all that, you could live reasonably well.
When you were at university in Dunedin, did you think it was possible to stay in New Zealand then and still become a writer?
Well, but then I should have explained sooner that at the time I went to Auckland, Brother Egbert had suggested that I ought to think of going to a university and perhaps getting a Rhodes Scholarship. Well, I'd never heard of either a university or a Rhodes Scholarship, but seeds sprouted rather rapidly in my mind in those days. So I went into these matters, and I decided that I would not only go to university, but I would get a Rhodes Scholarship. So that by the time I was in university in 1931, that was already in my sights. And it was not because I wanted to be a Don or had any academic ambitions, except, of course, always to be first, because you had to be first in order to get the scholarship to keep going with. But I had it clearly in my mind by then that I was going to be a writer, although what precise sort I wasn't sure.
Oxford, one of the great traditional seats of scholarship in Britain, was much more completely a university city when Davin went there in the 1930s than it is now. He took with him first-class honours degrees in English and in Latin from the University of Otago. He entered Balliol College and chose to read Literae Humaniores, that is classics with classical history and philosophy, regarded as the most difficult and demanding of all Oxford courses. he won a first in greats. A lifetime's association with Balliol was acknowledged in 1978 thus: calm judge of minds and manuscripts and men, a Daniel in the lettered lion's den, keen but not cutting, witty but not wild, the beer is bitter but the mouth is mild. So we salute him, marinated mellow, not Balliol's only but the world's good fellow. As an emeritus fellow of the college, he still has access to the private fellows' garden. Did you feel liberated intellectually or culturally after Invercargill and Dunedin?
Not so much liberated, I would say, as challenged, because these young Englishmen, who on the whole tended to be, those of my year, tended to be roughly 18 or 19. I was 23, and so in terms of life experience, I was about 1,000 years ahead of them. But in terms of the things that I thought I was good at, such as Latin and Greek and whatnot, they were far superior to me because they'd been better trained at better schools. And of course they had considerable natural intelligence. But if we'd been on a desert island and it had been a question of competitive cannibalism, I think I would have survived.
When you were doing a degree here in the late 1930s, you were one of those who didn't go to the Spanish Civil War. Where did your sympathies lie?
Well, unquestionably with the Republicans. Not for a moment otherwise. In fact, one of my introductions was to a Blackfriars monk called Father Gervase Matthew, and he and I went out for a walk, in the course of which we scarcely spoke, but we traversed an enormous amount of ground, and then we separated with obviously a silent but mutual agreement that we wouldn't meet again. And after the war I discovered this was because he was a Dominican, and he and his brother, the Archbishop, were the only two Dominicans, in fact the only two well-known Catholic figures who sympathized with the Republic and not with Franco. And he assumed that I, as a sort of Irish simpleton from New Zealand, was bound to be on the side of Franco. So it was a total misunderstanding, and we subsequently, after the war, became great friends.
Were you Catholic then when you came here?
I was on the slide, so to speak. The two things that I found hard to swallow were sexual restraint and the Spanish War.
Are you a Catholic now?
I'd ceased to be a Catholic, I would say, about 1937. But instead of going to Mass, I always went to the Campion Hall, which was the Catholic college, at the end of Mass, because I'd gotten in the habit of meeting a few Catholic priests there with whom I was friendly, and we used to drink a few bottles of beer before I went back to college, came back to college for lunch. So my lapse, as it were, wasn't a collapse, but a kind of just sort of gradual slithering away.
The young people here at that time were very strongly left-wing, a large number of them anyway. Were you strongly to the left at that time?
Well, I was very strongly to the left, but but I found it very difficult to be a member of any club. I couldn't join any party. And this was largely because the kind of Wickhamist Balliol man who was a communist or a deeply left-wing person had views about the working class and the proletariat which seemed to me to be too starry-eyed for acceptance. Because I took the view then, and take it now, that all men are very much the same, no matter what their income and what their class is so-called, and they all have considerable faults. And the proletariat, in many respects, is no better than the aristocracy, and vice versa. So I found all this kind of naivete too much to swallow, and I became what I used to call a Davinist to a Trotskyite, anti-Stalinist, ex-Catholic.
In 1939, Davin was awarded his degree, married Winifred Gonley, formerly a fellow student in Dunedin, and almost immediately went to a war which powerfully conditioned his life, as it did the lives of his whole generation of young men. Did you go to the war with a notebook like so many others, feeling that the experience would fuel your writing?
Well, on the whole, I expected the war to fuel the fires of hell for me, because that's where I expected to end up. But I did take a notebook. I had a naif confidence in my memory. I thought that I would remember things with ease. So I would put down 2 Gurkha encountering a fresh British officer with white knees who hasn't been in the desert long and who doesn't know the passport. And I'd leave it at that, because I'd think all the rest would come back to me. And now I find these inscrutable directions for short stories all over these blasted notebooks, and I can't make out what they are or what they mean. So I have to invent fresh stories based on bits of the diary that I never meant for short stories at all. But on the whole, I had it in mind to keep a diary and make what use I could of diary and of memory, yes. But as I had every confidence in being killed, I didn't take it too seriously.
At first, Davin was commissioned in the British Army. Then he decided to join the New Zealand Division, with whom he served as a company commander in Greece and Crete and as an intelligence officer in North Africa and Italy. But what was his reaction to rejoining his fellow New Zealanders after 4 years in England?
At first I thought, my God, I made a terrible blunder, because the first afternoon I went to my old, what was subsequently become my old battalion, the 23rd. Colonel Leckie, the commander from Invercargill, and Major Fife, the second-in-command from Gore, were very courteous to me as the latest recruit to the officers' mess, and shared their tin of Bonington's Irish moss, or whatever that herrings and tomato sauce stuff was, together with some frightful salad. And then they resumed their conversation, which was basically on whether Invercargill or Gore was the future capital of New Zealand. And I thought, oh, Jesus, this is where I came in. I ought not to have come in again. I should have stayed out. But after a good while, that sort of wore off. And when I got to know the company officers, Sandy Thomas and Rex King and Reg Romans and all manners of chaps who were unknown to you, but famous to me and famous in the annals of the battalion, really. I got rather fond of them, and they got rather fond of me as a kind of mascot, because you could take me to the pub and you could fill me up with booze, and I wouldn't fall down or in the creek or anything, but I would, if necessary, give them a discourse upon the nature of nothing that would keep them going until they got home and got to bed. So on the whole, we got on pretty well.
For the Rest of Our Lives was one of the early novels to come from World War II. When did you write that?
I began to write it, I think, I could prove it, but I can't be bothered going to the documents. I think I began to write it in late 1945, and I think I finished it about a year later. But I had been putting bits and pieces towards it for a year or two before that.
What makes you think there is a God, anyway?
Of course there's a God. Who do you think made you, eh? If there isn't.
Well, I know one of them is. I'm pretty shrewd idea the other one was. They never owned up to it.
And who do you think made them?
Oh, 4 people with similar taste, I reckon.
Yeah, but it must have started sometime.
Well, whoever thought of it first, it was a good idea. I'm on their side.
You're bloody hopeless, Shorty. Just a bloody heathen.
Oh, what's wrong with heathens, anyway? I've got nothing against heathens. It's Jerry's I'm fighting, not heathens. Jesus, the bastards have bracketed us, all right. Look here, Hainsey boy. If God made me, He make Hitler as well?
Yeah, of course he did.
And did He make flies?
Of course.
And the clap?
Yeah.
Well, I just don't see how a bloke could behave like that. And make beer as well. Must have been 2 other chaps.
Yeah, but that's why you need faith.
Oh, that's where being a sucker comes in, you mean. Look here, Hainsey. I'll tell you what. You say it needs faith. And if you think the same bloke could make booze and hangovers, you must have a hell of a lot of it, I reckon. So I'll tell you what. I'll toss you for it.
How do you mean?
Well, one of us tosses. Heads there is a God, tails there isn't. How's that?
That's bloody blasphemy.
No, it isn't. If God cares about my soul, and if he's in a sort of sport at all, he'll chance it. Besides, you said he's all-powerful. Well, he's getting a chance now, getting 2 souls for the price of 1. It's a dead cert for him. Go on, 2 out of 3 goes. There you are, fair enough?
You wrote of New Zealand soldiers at the end of the war in a short story. You were referring to them, and you said, quote, "We'd never bring the same energy to anything again." Was that prophetic? Were you like that?
One has to bear in mind that most of those men were in their 20s, and you never bring in the same energy to bear on anything except perhaps your wife after you're 30 as you did in your 20s. But also the cause, this was the last war to be fought, where you knew the goodies and the baddies. It was like like a true Western, if you can imagine it, a wild paradox. And it was a war worth fighting, and the men knew that. And they trusted their officers, and they trusted Freiburg, and in the end, after a good deal of hesitation, they trusted Montgomery. And they knew they were bloody well going to win. They were far too cocksure. And I remember when we were going to Greece, and I was privately predicting that this was ruin. It was a madness to go to Greece. They thought that all they had to do was, as soon as they met the Germans, fire at them, and the Germans would run away because they had met the redoubtable Kiwis. Well, this sort of conceit was knocked out of them fairly quickly, and they became hardened, veteran soldiers, terribly loyal to one another. And you've got to remember, man is a social insect, after all. And you can't take one alone. But if you can get a group united by a decent, a common idea, and working under a certain sort of discipline, you get a very powerful machine. But even then, it depends upon the individual, the background, his respect for his comrades, his desire for their good opinion, his desire for his own good. Time and again, men found themselves in a position where they could have escaped by running away. But who were they going to live with after they ran away? They'd have to live with themselves, and they didn't want to. So it's better to stand by, go through, take a chance.
Oh, good. Was it boiling? Mm-hmm. Good stuff. Well, anybody want to hear about my day of peril?
No. Not if it's another one of those yarns about how with a savage twist of the wheel you wrenched a jeep away from a bursting shell. And tears came into the General's eyes as he thanked you.
Funny old co, General, isn't he?
Oh, yeah? What's he been up to now?
Well, this morning, you know, we're up as usual. That's Sparrow fight. All in the jeep, me and the General in the front, and we've got Harry and the GI in the back. We're belting along the Aquafondata and up to the Inferno. You know, pretty soon after that, you break out onto the bowl. Well, as soon as I saw that stretch of flat land all around me, I put my boot down, just about went right through the floor. By the time I was thinking, well, 1 more mile to go, we'll be up the Torelli staircase road and we'll be Jake until the return journey. What do you think happens?
You had the whine of a shell, And with a savage twist of your wrist.
Don't be a bloody fool all your life, Shorty.
Yeah, shut up for once, Shorty. You might learn something. No, it wasn't a shell. It was the General. You know what he said?
No.
Stop.
Stop?
Yeah. Stop, Alec, stop, he says. Right there in the middle of the bowl. Well, when the old man gives you an order, there's only one thing you can do about it, isn't there, eh? What you're told. So I stopped. And there we were, 4 of us, sitting in a jeep, in the middle of the bowl. Sitting ducks. I don't know how Harry and the GI in the back were taking it. I sort of felt they were thinking about it the same way I was. Then the General pipes up again. Listen, he says, as if we weren't already listening. I mean, you could just about hear Jerry up there eating his breakfast sausage up in Belmonte. I reckoned I could hear them sliding the shells into the breeches of those guns of theirs. Oh, we were listening all right. We must have sat there for a whole minute, stiff as statues, except inside, of course, just listening. And then the old bugger pipes up again. You know what he said? He said, "Was that a nightingale I heard?" Yeah, no, I kid you not. Was that a nightingale I heard? I mean, I ask you, a nightingale. I thought to myself, well, you know, it comes to all of us one time or another. And then Harry pipes up. "No, sir, I think that was a blackbird." Yeah, no, I kid you not. Yeah, well, good for you, Harry, I thought. Didn't make you an ADC for nothing. You know what it takes to make an officer. Pacify the old man and maybe we'll get the hell out of here. Of course, I should have known the old man better than that. He immediately felt as though he had to prove his point. No, Harry, that's not a blackbird. I know a nightingale when I hear one. Listen. So we're listening again. I give one hell of a jump. So the other two down the back there. Because there was only a mortar over in Mortar Alley, but, you know, we were so strung up out there. Didn't think to hold it back. General turns round. He says, "Keep still, William. You'll frighten the bird." No, I mean, I ask you, frighten the bird? I was so scared I would have taken off myself if I'd had the wings. Tell you what, though. It was right then we heard it. In a little bit of a bush about 50 yards away. It was a bloody nightingale, all right. Singing fit to bust. I hadn't heard a nightingale sing like that since we skeltered through Athens, heading out to the beach before the sun and the Stukas came up. "Here you are," says the General. "Told you it was a nightingale. Didn't I, GI?" Of course, the GI, all poker voice, says, "That's right, sir." "All right, drive on, Alec," he says. Oh, Jesus, drive on. Nobody ever got to 4th gear faster than I did then. Got halfway up the Torelli Staircase Road before I remembered to change down. Bloody nightingale, eh? I don't know.
At the end of the war, Davin joined Oxford University Press, filling a job previously held by New Zealand writer John Mulgan, who died in Egypt during the war. The press was then headed by another New Zealander, Kenneth Sizem. It's the biggest university press in the world and one of the oldest. Men were making books at Oxford in the 13th century, and the printing press started in the 15th century, only 2 years after Caxton set up Britain's first press. OUP is now renowned for its educational and reference books. Its total output ranks it among the top 2 or 3 book publishing houses in Britain. Why didn't you go home after the war?
I thought at that time, in my childish gloom, that the Russians would be on the Channel within a year, and I thought it'd be more interesting to be watching it from England than from far away New Zealand. And again, there was the fact that there was no job for me in New Zealand, because I was in that position that so many New Zealanders have been in, of being overqualified. I was qualified to be a Don, or to be this, that or the other, but the jobs were simply not available in a country as small as New Zealand. And by this time, my power network, such as it was, lay in this country rather than in New Zealand. So the fact that there wouldn't have been a job for me in New Zealand, the fact that I didn't want to be a Don, and the fact that there was an obvious opening at the press were pretty essential to me.
You spent some years writing the official war history of Crete, and you held a full-time job down at the same time. Did that reduce the momentum of your fiction writing?
I was distinctly hard up. So I ought not to exclude the financial aspect of the thing, but basically I wouldn't have done it had I not felt that that Crete, for some special reason, was important to me, as it still is, but also that I could probably do it better than anybody else, and that that I owed that at least to the division for which I had this strong sentimental tie. But it meant an immense strain upon energy, and it took me, once I got down to real work, it took me about 5 years, and those were the 5 years in which I would have written novels which I subsequently did write, but which would have been better if I'd written them then than later, because my mind would have been fresher and I would have been less weary. And by the time I was deeply engaged in this Crete thing, I had also unfortunately got a reputation in the press for being reliable and efficient and able to get on with people. And so I found myself subject to the disaster of continuing promotion.
But despite work on the war history of Crete and his growing responsibilities at the press, the fiction kept on coming. In all, there are 7 published novels, 3 short story collections, and a volume of literary memoirs.
I arrived at St. Giles Church rather early and found myself reluctant to go in. I sat on a bench which looked out of the old graveyard, no longer used. These were the extinct memorials of grief, mellowed and perlustrated by rain and time, themselves in their turn crumbling to dust. Time still had to be lived. There was still the wind and the rain for those of us who had loved Mary.
Much of his writing was done not at the Davins' Oxford home, but at their 500-year-old Tudor weekend cottage 20 minutes away at Dorchester, which dates back to Roman times. You said in 1969 that you didn't think you'd written a major novel by then, and you probably wouldn't write one. Do you still feel that assessment?
I would if I could, so to speak. The 2 novels I have in mind, if I can ever get round to doing them, would certainly be major novels in the sense that, say, For the Rest of Our Lives is a major novel. But a major novel, I'm surprised to have caught myself, or allowed you to catch myself out using such an expression, because a novel ought to be a more or less perfect coverage of whatever its theme is, and the theme might be of an entirely domestic and minor character, or it might be a sort of world buster, but I'm not much interested in world busters.
There are some who think the best things you've ever done are the short stories. How do you rate them yourself?
I think that some of my short stories are very good indeed, as a matter of fact. Some of them are not outright bad, but not good enough. And at least I hope that the bad ones I have managed not to publish, because I've got a whole sort of file of stories that I wrote, especially in the last months before the war when we were in Paris, which I now don't think are good enough, and which I didn't think were good enough at the time. So I never bothered to try and publish them, and I don't think I ever will, but I might. Then, with a bit of fiddling about, I could probably turn them into quite good stories. But when you're persecuted by ideas for new stories, as I am, I'm tormented, like poor old Gulliver, by those huge wasps that came trying to bite him. That I haven't really got time to look back on the past. And it's all I can do to to cope with the future. And as for the present, of course, it's quite out of the question.
I know you keep a close watch on New Zealand writing. What do you think of contemporary fiction?
I think New Zealand is producing an astonishing amount of highly competent short stories, in particular, short stories and poetry. But it may be that the emphasis is directed on short stories because there hasn't been the outlet for published novels. But there are good novels being published, and you know, we have a new generation which is probably already passé in the view of the present generation, of chaps like Maurice Shadbolt and Joyce Cowley and so on, who've written extremely good books. And another promising sign is the rise of the Maori self-confidence in writing by chaps like Witi Ihimeera, if that is the correct way of pronouncing it, and not many another. But they'll have to go through awful crises of self-conscious confusion between political motives and the pure literary motive of getting something down on paper which represents the truth as you see it, and not the truth as you want it to be accepted by other people.
This is a marvellous setting here. I believe you get frequent visits from New Zealand writers, and that some of them even worked in here.
Well, practically every New Zealander turns up here sooner or later, at least, I mean, all the literary ones, and a great many others, because my interests extend a long way beyond literature. Joyce Cowley worked on a novel here. I'm afraid I've forgotten which one. And I think she liked it very much. I mean, liked the setting very much, because she liked the novel very much as her business. And Maurice Shadbolt, in a gigantic effort to comply with a deadline, finished his Lovelock, is it conjunction, connection, conviction, conviction? Or
Lovelock version.
Lovelock version. He finished that here. And the conditions are sort of ideal for a writer, because you don't have to know anybody except go along to the pub and say, how do you do, and I wonder whether it will freeze tonight, and that kind of thing.
The pub is almost a daily ritual for the Davins. They get there at evening opening time so he can claim his special corner chair, and there hold court among New Zealand expatriates and visitors. Dan, you're sort of president of the lounge here at the Gardener's Arms.
That is partly, well, at my age, all questions are historical, and therefore all explanations tend to be historical. I used to come here before the war as an undergraduate, and then after the war, when I came to work for the press, I found that it was a very convenient thing to have a phase intermediate between the office and your own house. Because if you let your friends, who rapidly developed from being your clients, into your house, you couldn't get them out again until about 4 or 5 in the morning. Whereas if you met them in the pub, then they got turfed out at closing time like anybody else. And if the evening had been exceptionally agreeable, as it only too often was, of course you could then go home and continue then. But gradually one tended to use the pub the way the French use a cafe, which is a place for that sort of marginal meeting point. There was a horrible word called interface they used to use when I was still in business, where you're not quite working and you're not quite being just socially friendly. There's something in betwixt and between. So it was very handy from that point of view. And then after I retired, my habits had become so fixed that they couldn't change. Mind you, it's fair to admit that I've only got to do one thing once, and it's a habit. That is to say, if it's a bad habit, I don't develop good habits quite so easily.
Is this where you keep in touch with New Zealand expatriates and visitors?
I tend to use it as a rendezvous for all my various kinds of friends, and they are very various indeed. But as some of my English friends complain, and still more my Swiss friends, there is an endless assortment of New Zealanders here, which nearly always means that the natives are in a minority. But I don't think the English have got any cause to complain about that. I still feel in many ways a New Zealander, but I resent the way New Zealanders think that if people leave the country bodily, physically, that they have in some way or another betrayed their mates, so to speak. The real test is a rugger match, and if the All Blacks are playing any of the countries in the major league, then I find myself backing the All Blacks. If Ireland are playing England, then I'm backing Ireland. If England are playing France, then I'm backing England. So, where the hell am I?